Welcome to the final session of this conference. The theme of this roundtable is the outlook of the peace process on the Korean Peninsula. Based on the previous sessions, we could clearly see that most recent scholarship on the Korean War goes beyond ideology or high politics and focuses more on human subjects. And I think this roundtable discussion will nicely complement some of the points that were brought up in the previous sessions. So I very much look forward to our discussion. I would like to first thank our discussants for participating in this roundtable. Each discussant will speak about 10 minutes, and then we'll move on to the general discussion among the presenters and moderators of this conference for about 10 to 15 minutes. We will then move on to ask questions from our audience. So to make virtual conference more meaningful, I think we have to make extra effort and use whatever tools we have to interact more between presenters and our audience. And this is our first virtual conference that JUX is hosting. So we did smaller events during the summer, but not like this big conference that that should have been a day and a half if it had taken place on campus. So please give us your feedback if you have any. We'll make sure to improve as we do more throughout this semester. And before I forget, I would like to thank JUX Associate Director Yeonho Kim, Program Coordinator Mina Kim, and our student assistants. Without their hard work, this virtual conference, first virtual conference, would have been impossible to do. So thanks once again. Now, I would like to introduce our discussants. To save time, I'll only mention their name and affiliation. So for their full bio, please refer to the program. Our first speaker is Suzy Kim, Associate Professor of Korean History at Rutgers University. Next, Keun-Sik Jung, Professor at the Department of Sociology at Seoul National University. Next, Gregg Brazinsky, Professor of History and International Affairs at GW. And finally, but not least, Christine An, founder and executive director of Women Cross DMZ. All right, I'll turn it over to Suzy.
Thank you so much. I'll just start right off because each of us have only about 10 minutes to leave enough time to have a discussion. Just wanted to start off by thanking everybody at GWIX for putting on this conference, so meaningful to mark the 70th anniversary, which I think in many ways, a lot of the programs that had been planned had to be cut short exactly because of the pandemic. But I think it's important to mark the anniversary as a way to say that it's long overdue that we come to terms for a peace settlement. I think the theme about the lived experience of the Korean War is a really important one. And as I think Professor Jung mentioned during the keynote yesterday, there's a tendency to highlight the veterans of the Korean War whenever there's state level commemorations of this war. But I think it's really important to actually think about the much larger sacrifices and suffering that was put upon the civilian population. And when we're thinking about the civilian population, oftentimes women, when we're discussing them as part of this, the history of the Korean War, it's much more in terms of as victims. But what I wanted to highlight today were actually the Korean women that were a part of an international movement of women who were very much active against the Korean War during the Korean War. It's a part of the Korean War history that is very little known. There is some research that is now being conducted more and more, and I'm actually working on a book about that. But I think it's important to remember that women were also very actively engaged during the Korean War to put a stop to it. So here I'm just going to begin sharing my screen. So I wanted to focus on the women's experience of the Korean War and the other side of the Iron Curtain. I thought Avram Agav did an amazing job this morning, basically laying out the socialist solidarity in which humanitarian aid was given to the North Koreans from across the socialist bloc. And there was actually a question raised, I think Jisoo raised it about, what was the women's role in that? Because there was a mention about the Hungarian Women's Alliance. And so this is actually to flesh out that particular question about what were the women doing, how were they organized together as part of this anti-war campaign. So the Women's International Democratic Federation was a broad coalition women's organization centered left of diverse political backgrounds that was formed in Paris in 1945. It was formed in Paris largely because there were so many French women who were part of the anti-fascist bloc during World War II, fighting against the Nazis. And a lot of these women basically came together and decided that they could not let another global war happen again. And so it was up to the women to make sure that that kind of conflict never arose. And so in November of 1945, the WIDF was formed. And the historian that's been really pathbreaker, instrumental in uncovering this history is Francisca de Haan, who is based at the Central European University. They, from the very beginning, because the French, as you know, after World War II, went straight into Vietnam again as a way to try to recolonize. And so they, from the very beginning, were against the French policy in Vietnam. And for that reason, they were kicked out of Paris as being too radical. And so they eventually had to relocate to East Berlin in 1951. The North Korean women, as part of the Korean Democratic Women's Union, joined the WIDF as a member organization in 1946, a year after, more or less, after they were formed in North Korea. When the Korean War broke out, there was great alarm, as you can imagine, because the whole purpose of this organization was to make sure that another world catastrophe did not happen. But here again, just mere 5 years after the World War II, you had another major war. And so the women decided to send a fact-finding commission to try to figure out what was exactly going on in the Korean War. And so 21 women from 17 different countries were organized and sent to Korea in May of 1951 for a 10-day period. There's an article that I published last year, so if you were interested in the more details about this, you can look at the origins of the Cold War feminism during the Korean War that I have cited right there. This is the delegation. This is the 17 different countries that the women hailed from, but I should definitely make a note that the women were not representing the governments at all. They were going in their individual capacities, and they went risking their own lives. 1951 May was very much still when the war was very hot, and the women were going straight into that war. And so if you look at some of the writings that the women have left, they talk about how they were leaving their wills, they were leaving their last letters for their families because they had to anticipate that maybe they would not be able to return. But at risk to their own lives, they went because they felt that it was important to see what was going on and to tell the story of the women that were impacted by the war. I should say, though, that the initiative, of course, came from the North Korean women themselves. So the two North Korean women that were responsible for the invitation of these international women's group was Park Jung-ae. She was the chair of the Korean Democratic Women's Union that was formed in 1945. It was actually the very first social organization that was formed in North Korea. And she ends up chairing that organization for 20 whole years, from 1945 to 1965. And I'm actually trying to work on a biography of hers at the moment. The other woman was Ho Jung-suk. She was the Minister of Culture in the North Korean government cabinet at the time. And she was also a very high-profile woman. These two women, their feminist credentials go all the way back to the colonial period. They were considered socialist feminists, labor organizers. In fact, Ho Jung-suk was known as the Kollontai of Korea because of her socialist feminist politics. So I'm just going to show you a series of photos that were gathered from both their trip. So this report is actually available online if you'd like to take a look at it yourself. So I encourage you to do so if you're interested. Some of the photos come from this, and then some of the other additional photos come from other archival materials that I've collected in the course of doing this research for this book on these women who deserve much greater recognition and credit for what they were doing so courageously. So you see, so the women the women took enormous time to basically get there. As you can imagine, they all tried to gather in Beijing before they continued on, but the whole process of getting there during that time was very difficult. But when they finally got there, this is the devastation that they saw. And you see repeatedly in their writing just how shocking it was. And remind you, these were women that are very familiar with the war because they went through World War II, and a lot of them basically said that it didn't even quite compare to the level of destruction from World War II. And so you see just the level of devastation in these photos. And they also were able to see the mass graves of civilians that had been massacred, many of them women and children that were buried in these mass graves. And you see the international women, they have their faces covered because of the stench from the rotting flesh. And you see them very visibly moved as a result of this. And the woman that you see, the international woman that you see here, this is Candelaria Rodriguez, who was from Cuba. And you can see her visibly devastated from the kinds of things that she was hearing from the Korean women that she was talking to. And here you see other members of the international delegation speaking to the women. I wanted to highlight these series of photos insofar as you see them directly communicating with them, of course, via an interpreter, but you see them holding their hands, you see them looking at their faces, you see them crying together, sharing the pain. This is Monica, I should say, actually this woman here is Maria from the Soviet Union. She was the editor of the Soviet Woman magazine. This is Monica Felton from the UK. And I'll say more about her in just a minute. And then you see here towards the end of their trip, they're basically talking about, you see Park Jung-hye here, and you see Ho Jung-suk here, and you see them basically having a discussion about how to craft this report that they end up with. And that was not an easy process, I want to emphasize, because I think there's been, and I'll come back to that, but and then they ended basically with the exchange of gifts. You see the embroidery from the Korean side with the flag of the Korean Democratic Women's Union being gifted to the international delegation. And then this is what the delegation left from the UK, Peace and Friendship with the Women of Korea. I wanted to highlight these two works for those of you that are interested in looking more into this, and the reason why I highlight these two individuals from the delegation is because they actually went into the group somewhat skeptical and wanting to maintain their objectivity and wanting to maintain a certain level of bipartisanship. They did not want to be viewed as being, pro-communist or pro-Soviet, because the women were already being branded even before their departure that they were essentially, puppets, or that they were essentially being deployed by the Soviet side in a kind of peace offensive. So if you look at their memoirs that they left from their time there, it's quite clear that the women had a lot of disputes, antagonisms, differences when they were having these meetings about what to do in Korea and how to craft this report. And yet they were able to do so on the basis of coming together across ideological lines in order to bring the truth about Korea because the women demanded it. And they often said this in terms of a shared sense of humanity, that it was important to do this. So here I just wanted to bring us very quickly kind of into the present as a way to think about how do we apply this historical case or example experience to apply to lessons for the peace process today. If you look, I have this picture up because it's of the Shincheon Museum, which still stands in North Korea, and some of the pictures that you saw of the mass graves are from this area. And I wanted to highlight that this museum went up in 1958, basically roughly around the same time that the United States deployed nuclear weapons into the southern zone. And so, in other words, throughout the 50s, you see, the archival kind of tracing that I'm doing of trying to see how much these women were able to keep in touch. You see letters being exchanged. You see them trying to meet each other at other international meetings. And so they try to maintain their connection as a way to bring a peace settlement to the Korean issue, because as we know, it ended merely with an armistice and not a peace settlement. And yet, and so there is a shared sense of humanity, but as things become much more difficult for North Korea, there's an increasingly a different narrative put out about the Korean War as kind of a heroic victory for the North Korean side, and that revenge must be wreaked upon the other side. This is basically to say, I wanted to reiterate a point that was made at yesterday's panel by Kim Hak-jae, who basically said that you needed a common commemoration. And so this is actually in the way. If you look at the way that the Korean War has been memorialized in the different participating countries, it's with completely different narratives, and all of them claim to have won it in some way or another. And that is not going to get us towards a peace process. I think a peace process requires recognition of mutual damage. In other words, the ways in which we were all hurt, as a way to create a common sense of mourning towards that common past. And so I would just offer that as a lesson, that in other words, the women's shared sense of humanity as a way forward to prevent this kind of large scale bloodshed from affecting everybody's lives, that shared sense of solidarity really needs to be carried into the peace process.
Thanks so much, Suzy. Well, you know, I'm a big fan of your work. I look forward to reading your next project soon. All right, now we'll move on to Professor Chung.
Thank you for Suzy and all presenters. Really, I enjoyed the yesterday and today session. As Suzy mentioned, I think after the studies, the comparative study of the war memorial in the museum is China, Korea, South Korea, North Korea, and America. At the time, I think about the commemoration is possible in Korea. It's very important. In this year, as a member of the committee, the 70 years of the Korean War, I suggest, but it's impossible. It's very, very big and huge the barrier to develop the commemoration idea. Anyway, let me short, small, give a comment all the presentation for the Jung Kim is very, very interesting presentation for me, and really I know the MPC and I at the time I related to the comfort woman economy in Korea, that MPC. One of my question is that what's different in Japan and Korea in relation to that MPC economy. I think the gap between the Japan economy and the American basement base economy and the other one in Korea is more big gap. So I think that it's a little bit different, I think. And second, Dennis Kim is also very, very important paper. Displacement, how to make the picture of the fraternity. Well, I think for me, in the if we divide the displaced person, one is the refugee, the other one is the compulsory evacuated people. In the near the borderline, so many people have been compulsory evacuated. So I think that it's a voluntary moving and is different from the compulsory forced moving. The other one is a relocation. Somebody choose the behavior to cross over, but the front line has been changed. By that, the belonging is different. The change. So I think life and belonging is very important agenda for the study of the Korean War and during the Cold War period. And I think Abraham Agov is very, very interesting for me because I presented the South Koreans 16 and 22 countries solidarity in this year. But for the North Korea, they have also the socialist countries solidarity from 1950. So I think in Korea generally, the Korean War is the civil war and the international in East Asia. But in a global sense, so many countries from Europe or the Southern America. So it's global sense of the Korean War has been developed at that time. So we try to develop the more global sense of meaning of Korean War by his presentation. And finally, the David Chang also, he even though he's my friend to study the neutral countries, the POW, is very important because for me, generally in Korean War has been divided two phases. One is the mobile warfare in first year, and the second phase is position warfare. But he tried to change the main frame. The war over territory, first war of territory, and second war over the POW. It's different too. One is the territory in terms, the other one is the people-oriented approach. So we can develop the core or two ways of the process of the Korean War. So it's, for me, is David Chang's idea is so good and important. And finally, he focused on the psychological warfare. Yeah, really, during the Korean War, the psychological warfare was very, very important. But after the Korean War, the psychological warfare is continued to the 1960s and 70s, even now. So the Korean War as a psychological war is very important idea, and we should develop that idea after the post-Cold War regime. If I have a time to discuss the life and the belonging, the main category of work studies could be what divided people into dead and survivor, and change their belonging by the voluntary moving and the involuntary occupied. In terms of the dead, war dead and the war believed and victim of murder. And furthermore, corpse and remained. Nowadays, corpse politics is very important for the United States and for the North Korean people. And dead survivor, the widow and orphan, even he himself survivor, but his most important relative has been died, widow and orphan. And the wounded survivor, wounded soldier, victim, and his refugee, separate families, diverse families, comfort woman, and mixed blood, and POW. This category, all the related to the life and belonging in Korean War and after the post-Cold War. So I think that this life and belonging should be focused on the Korean studies, Korean War studies. And finally, if we discuss the life experience of Korean War and under the division regime, one agenda would be a border problem, as I mentioned. Let me introduce the historical trajectory of the border area in South Korea. The border area formed both during and after the Korean War was the so-called enemy contact area, or an area continuously under the view of the enemy. As you know, there are two different border lines: military demarcation line by the armistice agreement and civilian control line by the order of the UNC. The civilian control line is another dividing line, and it is a practical control line that separate the inside and outside of the border area. In mid-1950s, during the formation of the retaken area, the displaced forced moved people and refugees came to their hometown inside the CCZ, the civilian control zone under the military selection, without any government assistance. So-called self-reliance stabilized village has been made. In the late 1960s, security crisis, the Park Chung-hee government, fully aware of the enemy facility, decided to establish the strategic village in this area, modeled on Israel, Kibbutz, and Moshav. The strategic village had two goals. for more rice production and to reinforce the border security. In addition to the monitoring the invasion of the spies and defending the vicinities of the DLG, the government sought to achieve the victory of psychological warfare. Such effort led to the formation of the strategic ability, starting with the Demari in Cheron from 1968. In these construction villages, there are two subtypes. One is the veterans settled down village. The other is the peasant settled down village, who are daily in and out of the civilian control line. In 1973, so-called Tongilchon, more idealized strategic village has been established. That half of residents are recruited from the just retired veterans and half of them from peasants. This unification village served as a political construct of utopian village in the early Semaul movement period. The unification villages show a logic of the camp and the space of the exception, which the forward zone has embodied in the last 40 years. The government strictly distinguishes those who can be inhabitant from those cannot, arranging and establishing new special order. The inhabitants under military control do not assert their basic right. This strategic ability can, even so much changes, are still working in South Korea, limiting the popular imagination of territory, security, and border within old Cold War frames. In the process of this study, I realized the importance of the global knowledge transfer or circulation of strategic ability. You can find the prior model in the militant colonial village 1930s in Manchuria. In the case of the Jeju Sasam and the Malayan emergency, we can find it too. When the South Korean military advice group visited the South Vietnam 19 and helped to make a plan for Vietnam's hamlet. So I think that even now, in Korean, the strategic village has not been studied yet. But I think in these studies, as I said, the global circulation of the Cold War frame technology. Yes, and another type is a special village in the border, United States-based village. 의정부, 동두천, 파주, 포천, and 평택, 군산, 외관. There are so many diverse base villages. So, and nowadays, some people ask me to make the trauma center for the old people. Some people who told me to establish the peace museum in the border or the base villages. So we can study. We should study more, and I think we can discuss about that idea. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It looks like there are a lot of topics to study for the Korean War. All right, now we'll move on to Gregg.
Thank you very much, and it was great to hear those interesting presentations. So I'm going to mostly focus my talk on China and China's potential role in any peace process moving forward. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history, but I'm mostly going to focus on contemporary policy. And I think to start off with the basic fact that there's never going to be a constructive solution to the problems of the Korean Peninsula, and there's never going to be a peace regime in Korea if the People's Republic of China doesn't participate in that peace regime. And I think part of the problem from the standpoint in Washington is that many policymakers are fundamentally wrong in how they see China and how they see the China-North Korean relationship. One of the things that you hear people saying in Washington a lot is China and North Korea really hate each other, or China and North Korea don't like each other. And so it follows from this wrong-headed assumption about China and North Korea that if we just pressure China or if we just cajole China, it will help us with North Korea. And it's never clear. Donald Trump had said, well, China is going to take care of North Korea for us. And I've heard Biden saying some of the same things. But the problem is that this idea that they hate each other and that they've always hated each other is really a gross oversimplification, I think. If you go back to the Korean War, I think the war really helped to forge a very close relationship between China and North Korea. It's true that they've quarreled occasionally, but I don't think that the legacy of the war has been forgotten in either countries. Both countries, both China and North Korea, do have their own narrative of the war. North Korea's narrative tends to go something like, we defeated the American imperialists with some help from our Chinese communist brethren. And the Chinese narrative tends to be a little more like, we went in and rescued the North Koreans. So there's a little bit of tension in those two narratives, but there's also a lot that they have in common about who their adversaries were, the fact that they were unified, the fact that there was this forged in blood friendship. And I think that's something that Chinese and North Koreans actually, it's actually been a long-standing trope in how they talk about their relationship. And I think it's something that we need to keep in mind. We can see this in the way that the war is and has been commemorated. And you can also see it in the ways that Chinese volunteers who have a long history of writing memoirs about their experiences serving in North Korea, write about the war, write about North Koreans, and have continued to do so to this day. I just did want to pick up on one thing that I found sort of interesting that Suzy was talking about before, which was the number of these women's groups and organizations that traveled to North Korea during the war, and some of those were from mainland China. In addition to this, there's just a host of other sort of non-governmental organizations from China, groups of journalists, groups of writers, groups of engineers who participate in the Korean War in different ways. So it's not just these groups of volunteers, it's also a much broader level of social and cultural interaction. And I think this really helps to shape close ties between them. And I think obviously today, the relation between China and North Korea isn't as close as it was during the Korean War, but I think that there's still some underlying affection between the CCP and the Korean Workers' Party. And I think there's more than enough sympathy to make sure that China is never just going to throw away North Korea or fix the North Korea problem for us because some new US president thinks that they should. And I think if lately, if anything, ties between China and North Korea have become even closer. I think the general approach that the Trump administration has taken towards China has a lot to do with this. The United States has been making China the scapegoat for a wide variety of domestic problems for a long time, ranging from the loss of domestic manufacturing jobs to America falling behind in the race to build 5G infrastructure, just scapegoating China for a wide variety of things. Now, I don't think that there's no areas where we should be concerned about China, and I'm not saying that the Chinese are angels, but there are ways to recognize China as a strategic and economic competitor without making them an enemy and a villain. But I think the Trump administration has made these populist criticisms of China to a large degree to mask its own failings. For instance, the administration's repeated use of the term China virus. It's not only a particularly malicious way of talking about it, but it's also something that draws on long-standing racist tropes in the United States about China and Chinese. And it incites, it contributes to and incites anti-China and anti-Chinese feeling among the United States population more broadly. And I think this is a problem. And unfortunately, it's been coupled with these efforts to limit Chinese activities in the US, ban Chinese students, other measures that I think are illiberal and go against what the United States should do and stand for as a democracy. I think the ultimate result of this policy, though, is going to be to make it very unlikely that China is going to play any kind of productive role in the peace process, and that if anything, China is going to be more likely to discourage North Korea from engaging with or pursuing rapprochement with the South. Many people tend to think of the CCP as a sort of a political monolith whose members all think in the same way and all have unfailing loyalty to Xi Jinping, but that's not true. There's actually a lot of diversity. There are some members of the CCP who have a more internationalist perspective and some who are more jingoistic. What America's current policy is doing is it's strengthening the most jingoistic anti-American elements of the CCP, and many of them actually like to see North Korea defy the West and are willing to tolerate and even encourage North Korea's weapons programs and provocations. For instance, one of the more nationalist Chinese officials, Li Jianzhao, who has a Twitter account that you can check out. He says some pretty he'll throw some real blockbusters out there once in a while. But he wrote that when both China and North Korea are confronted by the United States, they have a lot to discuss. And this was what he wrote before Xi Jinping's visit to North Korea. But you can see this idea that if the US is our adversary, we better pull closer to North Korea because they're our most reliable ally, right? And so this combination of Trump's declaration of a trade war, his harsh rhetoric towards China and Chinese citizens, all of this has made moderates in the CCP and Chinese citizens who are more globalist in their outlook see less and less benefit to pursuing good relations with the United States. So rather than seeing Korea as a region that needs to be stabilized and where you need to create a new peace regime, they're more and more going to see North Korea as China's only potential ally, and to some degree it is. There's frictions with Japan, frictions with South Korea, frictions with India. And so all of this is going to push them to encourage the hardliners in North Korea and help North Korea to evade UN sanctions, which I actually never think are particularly useful or productive anyway. In the end, I think the current state of Sino-American relations has seriously damaged the chances of moving towards a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, at least through the Trump administration. And if Biden takes a similar approach to China, I think it will continue. It seems more likely, unfortunately, that it's going to sharpen the political divisions that exist in Asia. I think that the only way out of this is for the US and China to move forward by acknowledging differences while working together to solve common problems and cooperate where they can, and recognize that stability and a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula is something that is and always has been very much in the interest of both countries.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks for bringing in that regional perspective. Very insightful. Thank you. Now we'll move on to Christine.
That was a grim picture, Greg. Well, thank you to everyone at George Washington University for inviting me to speak. It's so great to be with colleagues like Professor Jung and my dear friend Suzy. It's just I always learn so much from seeing her presentation over and over again, and just seeing the long line of women who have been on the front lines for peace on the Korean Peninsula. So today's my remarks are kind of shaped by my experience in doing this peace work. So in 2015, as many of you know, Suzy and I were among 30 women peacemakers from 15 countries that traveled across the DMZ from North Korea to South Korea. We traveled with Nobel Peace Laureates and American feminist pioneer Gloria Steinem, and we called for peace. We called for an end to the Korean War with a peace agreement, women's leadership in the peace process, and obviously family reunions. We held women's peace symposiums, both Pyongyang and also in Seoul, where we heard from North and South Korean women talk about the impact of the unresolved war on their lives. And we walked with thousands of women on both sides of the border in both Kaesong and in Paju. And we also walked with several thousand in Pyongyang. Since then, we've had the opportunity, and this does include Suzy, to bring several North Korean women to Indonesia and to China to participate in women's peace-building dialogues. And so these experiences, they shape my understanding of the conflict and what we must do to realize peace and security for Koreans, Americans, and the world. Unfortunately, for the last 30 years, Washington orthodoxy has held that the Kim regime must denuclearize first before peace can exist between the US and DPRK. Policy has been driven by the belief that more pressure in the form of sanctions, threats of military action, political isolation, these will convince North Korea to abandon its nuclear weapons. North Korea is the most sanctioned country in the world, and their nuclear arsenal is just growing. So while Trump's engagement was a positive step, it failed to be accompanied by a fundamental change in US policy. And the next administration, whether it's Trump's second term or a Biden one, they should reject the status quo and create the necessary conditions through normalization and trust building to achieve peace and security on the Korean Peninsula. Unfortunately, the Trump administration's approach, the maximum pressure, and Obama's strategic patience, which we are very concerned that Biden may adopt the same approach. This whole mindset, it cuts across partisan lines. And what we're seeing from the Democrats is not helping to advance the concepts of peace and diplomacy with North Korea. I mean, we see Biden attacking Trump for meeting Kim, for giving him a legitimacy in the international community. Well, the very act of diplomacy is to engage with one's enemy or even with one's ally. How do we expect to come out of a 70-year conflict without actually meeting and talking? So the problem is that powerful forces, I feel a little bit, I don't know, there's a part of me that feels really naive for saying this, but I feel it's so important to say this. But there are powerful interests at play that want to maintain the conflict because they profit from the continued tensions and war. Let's not forget that after the Singapore summit, what happened to the defense stocks? They plummeted. And then after the Hanoi summit failed, what happened to those? Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, they rose right back up. I mean, we know that there's a whole military industrial complex that was set by the Korean War, that quadruple defense spending in those 3 years. And unfortunately, that's what we're up against. And this may sound really bleak, as well as what Gregg said about the great power competition between the US and China. But I guess I'm here to say that there are some reasons to be hopeful. For one, there is actually growing bipartisan support for peace with North Korea. In a YouGov Data for Progress poll that was conducted last year, 2 out of 3 Americans support a peace agreement with North Korea. And in fact, the greatest support was among Republicans, 76% of Republicans, independents, 64%, Democrats, 63%. There is growing support for a peace agreement in Congress. Women Across DMZ worked with Congressman Ro Khanna to introduce House Resolution 152, which calls for an end to the Korean War with a peace agreement. And now it has nearly 50 co-sponsors. Now I know that does not sound like a whole lot, but let me tell you, a decade ago, when we were commemorating the 60th anniversary of the Korean War, we could only get 2 members of Congress to call for peace with North Korea. And that was Barbara Lee, who was the only member of Congress that voted against the authorization to use military force, which I think is a very symbolic point to make today on the anniversary of 9/11. And Dennis Kucinich, who is no longer in Congress, but he is known as, a peace champion. So we have significantly grown the number of members of Congress that have been actively speaking out about peace and have co-sponsored this resolution. And this shift is the result of many factors, including the incredible grassroots organizing by multiple generation Korean Americans, by veterans, by peace activists, humanitarian aid workers, small business owners, academics. At Women Across DMZ, we have a team that's working in tandem on grassroots organizing and also in Washington advocacy. And through our campaign that we launched with other feminist organizations, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Nobel Women's Initiative, and the Korean Women's Movement for Peace, we now have 11 chapters across the country. And in June, we organized a huge advocacy week. We had to shift everything online and virtually. Over 200 people participated across the country from 26 states. And because of our activism, we yielded 4 more co-sponsors of this resolution, including most recently, Brad Sherman from Southern California. He's a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Asia Pacific Subcommittee. He wields significant influence in the Democratic Party, and this was a huge shift. If you see some of the comments that Brad Sherman made during the Singapore summit, it's incredible to see how grassroots power can change the mindset of people in Washington. And I think that, we also have to be hopeful about recent primaries, the congressional election in New York of Eliot Engel. I mean, that for, most people that don't understand about US politics, that is so huge. He was the Democratic chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And on the issue of North Korea, he was a huge obstacle. He was not willing to budge. He toted the line that there is no concessions to North Korea until they denuclearize. And so I think it's very exciting that we may have a different Congress that will be younger, that will be more progressive, and that'll be more pro-peace. But, I think the point that Suzy and I both make is that there won't be lasting peace unless there is women's participation. If you look at peace agreements that were negotiated between 2000 and 2016, both women's participation in civil society and in official peace processes ensured that a peace agreement was signed, but that it also included gender provisions. And I think what's so interesting in the research that has been coming out is that there is a really important nexus that gets established between the official women negotiators and the women's peace movement. We saw that in Colombia, we see that in the Philippines. And this is also a recent study by Georgetown University of peace processes over the last 30 years. They found that the participation of women's groups helped legitimize the formal peace process among the public. They ensured that the final agreement included gender provisions, which is critical because according to political scientist Valerie Hudson, gender equality is a greater predictor of peace in a country than wealth, religion, or level of democracy. And so that's why we've been calling for civil society and women's groups to be involved in the peace process. I think we've waited long enough for the leaders to bring us peace, and we have a unique role to create the political space for peace. I want to show the video, so I think I'm going to wrap up by, there is one thing that's really exciting is that the South Korean women, our partners, they managed to work with President Moon, and he appointed the first ambassador of gender equality. And so that's really exciting. Her mandate includes women, peace, and security. And so I'm just going to close by saying that, a renewed conflict on the Korean Peninsula would just be devastating. We know from the Congressional Research Service that finds that in the opening days of a conflict, without using nuclear weapons, 300,000 people would be instantly killed. We can and we must end the Korean War, not just for the millions of Koreans, like Professor Jung, who have lived with the constant threat of war and families that have been divided for 3 generations, but I think it's for us in the United States. Like, the American people are just sick and tired of endless war. It's just clear how the militaristic framework has totally failed us. In the United States, 53 cents of every dollar is spent on the military. And the pandemic, I think, has laid bare that all the guns, tanks, and missiles in the world mean nothing if people don't have economic security, if we don't have housing, if we don't have healthcare or a safe environment. And so ending the Korean War would be a major step forward. And we all have a role to play.
All right, thank you, Christine. Well, that was very powerful talk. I mean, it's been 70 years, and I think we still have a long way to go. But I think staying positive and whatever we can to do would be something that is, at least we can continue to, make action. All right. So I think we'll now just open up for general discussion. If you have any comments to make among participants, please feel free to do so. Before that, just out of curiosity, I have a quick question, Suzy. In what language did these women communicate in?
So there were interpreters, like they would have little kind of like pods. I mean, that word comes to mind just because we're used to using that word now. But they would have like little pods of different interpreters familiar with different languages. So there would be like the Russian pod or the Chinese pod or the English pod. And so there would be different interpreters that were scattered between the groups of women. And I, because I had such a short amount of time, I felt like I was like stumbling over my own words to try to get everything out. But the women actually divided themselves up into 4 different groups once they finally arrived in Korea, as a way to try to cover as much ground as possible. So then the 4 groups scattered to the different provinces, and then they came together for the final report. I should also say that the report was compiled in 5 different languages, so English, French, Russian, Chinese, and Korean, and then they were subsequently translated into many other languages. So there are versions of it in multiple languages. Maybe there's one in Bulgarian, Avram, I don't know, but it might be worth looking into. So I forgot to kind of highlight the last slide that I had as I was talking about the importance of commemorations, because I wanted to kind of contrast that rather, vengeful and traumatic commemoration of the Shincheon, the civilian massacre that happened there, with the much more hopeful one that happened basically very soon after the 2000 summit between North and South Korea. So the last slide that I showed was of the reunification monument. And of course, Christine and I are very familiar with that because we did our major march, the walk, our peace walk in Pyongyang, through that gateway out of the city. But that highway is called Reunification Highway. And then on the outskirts of that highway is the Reunification March. And it was specifically, the monument was specifically built to commemorate the 2000 summit. And and I think it's not entirely coincidental that the monument is composed of 2 women, right? They're the ones that are bringing peace. And so, but I would just want to highlight that so often women are kind of iconized, or they're like put into different things as symbols, but then we're not invited to the peace table, as Christine mentioned. And the importance of that, I think, is really important to remember.
I think, based on your presentation, I mean, what fascinated me is, that this Park Jung-hye and Ho Jung-soo beginning this movement campaign. I mean, I know you're, still in the in the middle of conducting a research, but it would be really interesting to know, I mean, how all this began.
You mean the delegation?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It is. So in addition, I should just mention, so in addition to the Women's International Democratic Federation was also a major partner in another umbrella international organization called the World Peace Council. And the World Peace Council still exists to this day, actually, despite the fact that the Cold War is over. And it's interesting to look at, I don't think there's been a proper study done of the history of the World Peace Council. I've only just seen kind of sporadic articles here and there, but there hasn't been major research done on that. But the World Peace Council was also a very important venue by which the Koreans were involved in the international peace movement, even before the start of the Korean War. So, for example, Han Seol-ya, who was the Minister of Education, and a major kind of colonial era, I guess, writer and thinker, he was the head of the Korean National Peace Committee that was a member of the World Peace Council. And it so happens that when we did the peace walk in 2015 that Christine was talking about, the National Peace Committee was a major partner that assisted us in making that happen.
When the Hanoi summit held, I imagined that the Kim Jong-un's mind, even though he's young, but so he has no memory about the Vietnamese war. What's the meaning of Vietnam for the North Korean people, North Korean leader? But however, the Vietnam after the Vietnam War could normalize with the United States around 1990. But North Korea cannot make the normalization with the United States. What's the difference between North Korea and the Vietnam for the United States policy or United States leaders' mind? It's one of my long question. Just after only the 15 years later, the United States make a normalization with the Vietnam. But in case of the North Korea, 70 years ago, fight. But even now, no, mistrust is very long standing. So what's the different United States leaders' mind? I think if it's one of my keeping question.
You know, I would say a few things to that. I think that's a very good question, Professor Jung. One thing that's interesting is that the president who played the important role in normalizing relations with Vietnam was Bill Clinton. And at the end of the Clinton administration, there was very positive movement towards having talks with North Korea. I don't know if that would have resulted in normalization or not, but there was definitely there was definitely movement, and Clinton was very supportive of Kim Dae-jung's policy, the Sunshine Policy. But then in 2000, of course, Bush gets elected, and his policy is basically ABC, anything but Clinton. Clinton was doing it, it must be terrible, so we have to switch. And immediately, he took a much tougher approach towards North Korea. And then, of course, after September 11th, he labeled North Korea part of the axis of evil, even though North Korea's connection to the September 11th attacks was non-existent. So I think that is, so I think part of it may be political change in the United States. As I think that's one explanation of it. I also think that if you look at the U.S. ROK alliance, some of the things that Christine talked about before are also quite relevant. Our troop presence in South Korea, and our investment in the military alliance, and sort of the fundamental role that the U.S. believes South Korea plays in containing China. And we don't really have that in Southeast Asia as much. So I think that, you know, there's also very different structures that, that govern it. And I also think that there might be some difference in the Vietnamese mindset and the North Korean mindset. I think one thing that makes it a little bit easier for Vietnam to engage with the rest of the world is that they won, and they they threw they threw the United States out, and they achieved national unification, which North Korea didn't achieve. And I think that's also an important distinction between the two countries. So I can't really completely give a fully satisfactory answer to your question. I think it's a very good question, but what I can do is try to point to a few factors which I think play into that.
I would just add two more things to Gregg's already awesome presentation response. And one is that Vietnam is one of the countries that basically made peace with the US by executive order. There was not a process of Senate ratification, which requires 2/3 of the vote, but it just was basically by executive order. And then the other thing I think is interesting and probably symbolic for North Korea was that in the process of normalizing relations with the US, they were able to maintain, right? Generally their political system, their economic, while opening up, you know, their economy. So I think that it seemed to be a fitting venue for a potential diplomatic breakthrough with the US.
I would just add that, I mean, I would just underscore what Gregg said about the ending of the two wars being so different. I mean, the fact that Vietnam won, I think, is huge. I mean, I visited Vietnam, and the sense there's I mean, going back to the point about commemorating the wars and having a commonality over the narrative about the war and the way you remember it. I mean, of course, it's still very much contested, and there's going to be folks that, you know, talk about Vietnam as having been a terrible loss. But I think during that particular war and since, there's been so much reflection and retrospection. And even if you just, speaking of, you know, memorials, if you just look at the Vietnam Veterans War Memorial versus the Korean one, it's so entirely different. And Professor Jung, you know, the special issue that we did in the Korean War Memorials delves into that. But it really is a different way in which we think about that. And I think the generations today, you know, if you talk to the students, they talk about the Vietnam War as a very sobering experience that basically taught us, you know, don't mess around, right, in places you don't know anything about. Whereas that's not the memory of the Korean War. And it has everything to do with the way that I think it affected domestic politics.
I also learned a lot from all the presentations, and I have a question and some thought about Suzy's presentation. And I think this Women's League is really, I think, impressive history. And your this question about women's role in the peacemaking process. You said that this women's shared sense of humanity is very kind of inspiring kind of source for us, which I agree. But at the same time, I think that the women who visited North Korea in 1950s, it shows that how we should make it a feminist agenda, right? Because that when we say that the women share the kind of like experience of like, it does say, of course, it does have a important say there, but at the same time, we don't want to say that naturally being women means we are all anti-war, all right? So how we make, I mean, I know you have maybe tons of discussions about this, but so this, and so I had one question is whether there was an actual kind of discussion or debate about how to address this as kind of feminist question among these women delegates, and how you see those kind of their activism in that from that kind of perspective. And also I was wondering, I mean, there are women from UK and Canada as well, but as you said, they didn't represent their country, nation at all, right? So if they had this kind of like some shared idea of like socialist feminism about anti-militarism and anti-war kind of like theorization and conceptualization, I think that's really, it can be really interesting story. And another thing is, I do agree that when we discuss war, women is usually that kind of a topic of victimization narrative, and as you said, women as very active participants in this entire movement is really, in that sense, I think important. But at the same time, it suggests, I think, this kind of binary between victimization or victimized kind of subject versus active or agency and kind of approach is something we really try to overcome in this feminist scholarship for last, I think, 20 or 30 years. So for me, I kind of, for my research, I am very cautious about calling those women from wartime as prostitutes. Not because I don't see the continuity between the colonial, from colonial period, US occupation, wartime, and post-war. But two things. One is a historical reason. This idea of indefinite occupation, I mean, US occupation, is very post-World War kind of concept and practice. So the huge difference between the post-World War II US occupation and then that before the World War II is after the war done, then they left. And now we have this concept of indefinite occupation, especially during the Korean War. That idea kind of became like consolidated. So for example, San Francisco Treaty that granted the Okinawa to US for indefinite time until peace arrives in this region. We never know what that peace means here, right? So during the war, during the Korean War, the men and women in Korea did not know how this war would end and whether US troops would stay here as for the next several decades. And so for them, this idea of the camp town kind of framework did not exist yet. So I think we need to be a little bit cautious about that, because even though there is, of course, this kind of state military alliance over this women's body and such, but at the same time, that kind of framework cannot simply apply to this wartime history. So that's why this prostitution or comfort women, those kind of language, I think it needs to be used a little bit more cautiously. And so instead, I try to use sexual transactions, which covers kind of their action, but that doesn't kind of fix these women's time and space and a certain kind of like that moment, like when they made this transaction with the soldiers, they didn't kind of like explain their entire experience. And also, if you ask whether they were victim or active participant, if you do, back to Gregg's question yesterday, if you do interview with these women, everybody has different story. One thing for sure, nobody wanted to have a war in their on their soil. Nobody wanted to have a war there, okay, right? But otherwise, everybody has different story about their relationship with family, GIs and such. So we cannot say this war, whether this war was opportunity for them or they were totally victimized. I don't think we don't need to be forced to choose either A or B. But instead, we need to try to understand those experiences without confining them into certain kind of like box here. So, and also I think one thing, these kind of things, what it suggests is that right after the World War II, 1945 to up to maybe I think early 1950s, there were different possibilities that could have happened. And why those different alternatives and those different possibilities were in the end closed? I think that's a very important question for us to think about what we can do now and what kind of like peacemaking we can do together, and nothing like this grand kind of narrative, corridor narrative. They kind of this conspiracy theory or this big power, Washington, Tokyo, Seoul, and those things. Even those, I mean, if you look at military documents, they did not know that much about the country, history, and even what they are doing. All those policies sometimes were decided overnight with little discussion, right? So instead, there's all those possibilities for less violence, less killing, and such. Why they were kind of like closed at some point. I think those questions maybe we can think about a little bit more.
I think I definitely agree with your point that we definitely need to go beyond that dichotomy, and yes, everybody's experience is different. I mean, nobody's the same, right? So then, as a historian, how do we make sense of all these different stories? And I think that's our task here. Anybody would like to respond?
Jisoo, what I have one more question to the David. In terms of the psychological warfare, nowadays the United States and the Sino-United States relation, the Taiwan, so-called the Taiwan problem, can be interpreted newly, I think. So what do you think about that idea of the contemporary Taiwan problem between the United States and China in terms of the psychological warfare? Would you like to explain?
Sorry, I didn't catch it. So what problem?
Taiwan problem.
Oh, the Taiwan problem.
Nowadays, the focus is the South Sea of China to the Taiwan. So the Taiwan problem has been rising up nowadays.
Yeah.
So I think that the new interpretation of the Taiwan problem in the psychological warfare between the United States and China, I think.
About the current situation between Taiwan and China, is that what you were asking?
And the U.S., the triangular relations.
Right. Well, I mean,
yes. The relation between China and Taiwan, but more important, between the United States and China, the Taiwan problem is rising up, I think.
Without even mentioning Taiwan, you look at Hong Kong.
Yeah. I mean, I think right now, what worries me in that context is that the U.S. is tending to look for ways to pressure China, and Taiwan has always been one of them. And so I do think, some of the things that you've seen with the WHO, part of that was because the WHO was initially dismissive of Taiwan, and I think it made a mistake in doing that. But I think, now the US has, been more hostile to WHO, but I think you're also going to see the US more supportive of Taiwan playing a role in international forums, perhaps greater willingness to sell weapons to Taiwan. So I definitely think that's something that can further exacerbate frictions in Asia. I also wanted to go back to some of the things Jungmin said. I also think that you raised sort of a lot of very interesting and important points about how we should see the impact of the war, how we should see just the lives of people that were impacted. And I think when I raised the point about structure and agency yesterday, I mean, I think you had a very interesting response about what actually is structure and what actually is the agency. But I think that's really I think that's really important going forward as well. How do we see what the structures are that dictate the affairs of the peninsula, and how do we see our own agency, right? And I think that's a theme that a lot of people touched on in this roundtable. I mean, I think some of the things that Christine is doing in her organization is sort of an effort to take agency, if you accept that term, Jungmin, you know, to sort of take agency away from the traditional players. And, you know, I think it's something that I do think what she says is encouraging, and that it does, you know, you can sort of change ways of thinking and maybe, you know, change the structure itself from below to some degree. So I think, you know, I think you raised a lot of interesting points. I don't know if I can, I think if I tried to address everything you said, we'd go way over time. But I just wanted to bring that up as well.
Of course, there are also kind of compromised approach, like agency within structure or something like, and this is endless question. If you put this as a structure and agency, the one way I answer this question is, well, capitalism does not work without labor workers, but that doesn't mean the workers are entirely like victimized. They are historical actors within the system, right? So in that sense, it does have this kind of contradiction within, right? As historians said, that the system or that the structure does have that kind of contradiction, that it only works with that kind of like exploitation, if we are talking about capitalism or militarism, right?
I just wanted to second, I guess, what everybody's already said, but just Jungmin's insights about, I mean, the poverty of theory around agency, I think is something that really, I mean, people, I mean, it's been an academic debate for a very long time, but I don't know whether there's been a very satisfactory way, at least within feminist theorizing about, you know, is there a new concept beyond agency that we can come up with as a way to think about this so that it's not the binary framework that, as you suggested, that, you know, we don't fall back into. I'm sorry that if my presentation somehow reinforced that binary. That wasn't the intention.
No.
But right, but just wanted to say that yes, I totally on board with that. But I did want to, because you did ask a couple of questions that I think I can kind of clarify, which is, you know, what was the conception of feminism and womanhood for these women that were involved in this campaign, and then also what was the conception of peace. And this is actually at the heart of kind of the story that I guess I'm trying to research and write about. And it's essentially this idea that, you know, motherhood actually becomes a really strategic way by which women during the Cold War tried to cross ideological divides, so that no matter what your politics were, no matter what your religion was, your concern for the future generation of your children, so basically your concern for your children was something that motivated, that brought women together. And you see this iteration over and over in so many settings. And even in this moment of COVID and Black Lives Matter, in Portland, for example, there was that whole row of mothers that they were told to basically wear, like, if you wear clothes like you're going to Target or something like that, as a way to identify themselves. And they all wore yellow and identify themselves as like ajumma in Korean language, right? To basically create a barrier between the protesters and the riot police.
Yeah.
So this gets played over and over. But what's interesting to think about is, you know, are they actually relying on an essentialized notion of motherhood, or are they actually expanding this conception of motherhood so that it's a social motherhood and it's not necessarily tied at all to whether you're biological mothers at all? So it could even apply to men, it could apply to, you know, anyone. It's just the concern for, you know, the future of humanity that just unites you and that makes you an honorary mother. So that's one thing I would say. And in the same way, the conception of, I think, womanhood was constantly something that they were also negotiating, so that they were quite aware. If you look at the internal discussions, they did not want to essentialize themselves in any way. They did not want to make the argument that women were somehow biologically, you know, made to advocate for peace, because they understood that that was not the case. But it's really the socialization that goes into women as caretakers that ends up then, you know, giving them the tools and the conditions by which they then, you know, take this and run with it. And I think Christine can probably say a lot more about that in the ways that, you know, it's been used in her own organizing. And I would also say that the conception of peace is something that is key. So the women are debating what do we mean by peace? And is it the kind of pacifist peace that some of the Western pacifist peacemakers are advocating. And the third world women are absolutely clear that that is not a peace. A Cold War, presumably that maintains a kind of status quo or a balance, is not in any way, shape, or form a peace that these women are advocating. So there is a way in which it's really kind of tricky to balance armed struggle for decolonization, that they're actually saying that is a struggle for peace for them. So it's a very tricky kind of theoretical question, I think. Really interesting to see the women themselves debate it.
So I think we're running out of time. So Janice, if you could make
I just had a sort of a question or even a challenge that I think most periods of Republican motherhood, right? Motherhood, expressed at the formation of a republic, tends to be fairly pro-conservative and pro-war. Like Taisho feminism, and I would even say that the Taehan Omani Yeophae was extremely, conservative. So I would be inclined to not associate certainly Korean motherhood or femininity with anything pacifist. Like that, until quite recently, I would say you would have to go past that first sort of Republican motherhood phase, right? And we would almost need to get into rights-based feminist phase for, I think, some of these realizations of peace to even be achievable. I don't know. I haven't really thought about it, that particular leap, but from what I can see in the federations of women like around the world and so forth, that this is I don't really see them associating themselves necessarily with peace. That Republican motherhood meant, rearing sons to become, good citizens, mainly because the infrastructure was not yet ready. Whether it was in the early days of the American Republic or, Taisho Republic. And I think that tendency continues, throughout the latter half of the 20th century with certainly South Korea. So, this is, how would you frame, these women along with that sort of tendency then? I mean, if I were to ask as
it's about the fluidity of these concepts, really, so that it gets applied in whichever way, so that just by hearing motherhood, it doesn't automatically mean conservative, or just by hearing feminism, it doesn't mean one thing. And then and I should actually qualify. I mean, I don't know if I used feminism during my presentation, but I guess in my article I used it, and I should qualify that by saying that the women themselves never use that term.
Okay.
And so there's a whole other separate discussion about that. But just, because I know that we've run out of time, but I wanted to just I don't know whether I ever made it very clear. And I think maybe just to tap into this particular moment of COVID, like I've just been so impressed with how easily everybody shifted things online, like this conference, for example. But as Jisoo mentioned at the very beginning, opening the evening panel today, we miss the face-to-face, we miss the chats that we can have informally outside of the formal sessions, none of which we can do anymore. And I think, the emphasis that you see over and over from the women that left records about what this experience meant to them, going there physically at great risk to themselves was exactly that the face-to-face, the being there was absolutely important. So this is just to say, like, the bans that we have over travel, whether COVID or no COVID, because now, like, American citizens can't go to North Korea at all. And depending on the state of relations between North and South Korea, South Koreans may or may not be able to go to North Korea. And all of that actually impacts the way in which the peace process can proceed or not. So at the very basic level, I think it's important for us to realize the importance of human contact as a way to build empathy. I mean, I don't know, maybe that sounds naive, kind of like what Christine said earlier, but if we don't recognize our common vulnerability in this time, I don't know like what else to say.
Totally agree with that. We are actually over time, but I would like to get, at least ask one question from our audience. And then I think we can end the session. So I think Dominic Nozzarella asked, in your opinion, do you believe that reunification of the peninsula could ever come from a purely Korean effort, meaning a joint effort between North and South Korea without Chinese or American involvement? Anybody?
Yeah, can I say something, just a general remark which addresses partially this question? Well, North-South relations are inseparable from this architecture of confrontation and war. Actually, two wars, the Korean War and the Cold War. And in this architecture, the United States and China are very important critical components. So without solving this general problem of war and peace, relations between North and South cannot be solved as well. And any thought of reunification will be just a dream. So by addressing the peace and changing this institution of war and confrontation, we cannot solve the inter-Korean relations as well. And we've been witnessing many times some rapprochement, warming relations between North and South, but always reaching a wall, hitting a wall because of this decades-old architecture of war, which can be addressed first. So, on that note, related problem to current negotiations, different approaches. So, US and North Korea, I think, represent the main axis of war and confrontation. So, unless their negotiations have some headway and some movement forward, all other issues, I think, cannot be solved. And treating North Korea as a defeated country from the Korean War is another main problem. Here, Gregg made an interesting comparison with Vietnam in terms of unified country and divided country and defeated country, and some equality in relations between US and these Asian countries. So, and on more specific kind of platform, the current negotiations, this all in one kind of approach, denuclearization first and everything else follows, peace, etc., is very wrong, and it doesn't go anywhere. So this gradual action by action, which I think even in Washington, policymakers come to terms with this, and there is a slight movement toward this direction. And my sense is a second Trump administration may have a little bit better chance in moving toward that path toward peace agreements. This is my sense. This is my sense.
Okay. We're running out of time.
Thank you. Well, I think we're over time, but it has been a 2-day conference, yesterday and today. We put I must tell you, yes, we did struggle to put this conference together after all this pandemic, right? I mean, but I truly appreciate everybody who participated in this conference, because I know how difficult it must have been over the summer, and to everything slowed down, and in terms of research, writing, and just everything. So I really, really do appreciate your participation, and also our audience. I mean, this must have been really, different experience to be as an audience of virtual conference, and it is also the same for us as organizers, and also I guess presenters. So but since we have to maintain this format until the end of this year at least, I think it will very likely go beyond this year. But you know, I guess we just have to adjust to the new, you know, new format and improve as we do more conferences and events like this. So once again, thank you so much. We, you know, if we were on campus conference, we would have to go for a drink, have tipuri, right? But we can't. So I guess we can just, you know, have a drink on our own.
Rain check
Great.
for a future date.
Right. Okay. So thanks to our audience as well for staying late until this evening. And Professor Jung, thanks so much for, you know, staying. Well, that's early. Well, now I guess it's 10.
Waking up early.
Right.
He's
That's
starting
early.
his day.
It's really early for Avram because it must be like 4 or 5
4:30.
p.m., right?
Yeah.
So, and also for David, I mean, you know, we're all living in different time zones here. So, well, where are you, Christine?
Hawaii.
Hawaii?
Yes.
Okay.
That's so hard, right?
All right. But anyways, thank you so much. And well, have a great weekend. And well, hope to catch up again sometime soon.